Junhee, and we're going to show you how to practice your flashcards today. Are you ready? Let's go. Now we're ready to practice our flashcards. Who's the top line of treble clef?
F.
If you know the top line of treble clef is
F.
then you know the space right below it.
E.
Good. If you know the top line is
F.
then you know the space above it.
G.
If you know the top line is
F.
then you know the next line down has to be
D.
Now, who's this?
F.
Who's this?
E.
Who's this?
G.
And this.
D.
Very good. So who's the bottom line of treble clef?
E.
If you know the bottom line of treble clef is,
E.
then you know the space above it.
F.
If you know the bottom line of treble clef is,
E.
then you know the space below it.
D.
If you know the bottom line is
F.
who?
F.
Who's that?
E.
Then you know the next line up.
D.
Good. So who's this? The bottom line.
E.
Who's this?
F.
Who's this?
D.
And who's this?
D.
Very good. You know that group. Now, if the top line of treble clef was F, right? Who's the first little line above that?
A.
So if you know the first little line is,
A.
then you know the second little line has to be.
C.
So if you know the first line
A.
and the second line,
C.
then you know above the first line
E.
and above the second line.
D.
All right. So who's this?
A.
Who's this?
C.
Who's this?
B.
Who's this?
D.
Very good. Now, do you remember who the bottom line of treble clef was? Who's the bottom line of treble clef?
E.
Play it. Right, so if the bottom line is E, who's the first little line below that? Good. Now, if you know the bottom line is, the first little line is,
C.
then who's the second little line?
A.
So who's the first little line?
C.
And the second letter line.
A.
Then right below the first
B.
and below the second.
G.
Right, so who's this?
C.
Who's this?
A.
Who's this? And who's this? Excellent. And the last group is based on 3 spaces up. Do you know who 3 spaces up is?
C.
Very good. If you know 3 spaces up is,
C.
then you know the next space down is...
A. D.
No, because when you go from a space to a space,
Oh.
you skip a note.
Oh,
There
yeah.
you go. So who's 3 spaces up again?
C.
And the next space down is...
A.
Now the line between those 2 spaces is...
D.
Very good. So who's this? 3 spaces up.
C.
And...
A.
And...
B.
Very good. Now you know all your flashcards in the treble clef. Now we're ready to do the bass clef flashcards. Junie, before we start, can you point out where middle C is? Where's middle C? This is just so everybody knows where we are. Play it. There, that's middle C. Okay, so now everyone knows where we are and we're ready to start. Who's the bottom line of bass clef? Say it.
G.
If you know the bottom line of bass clef is,
G.
then you know the space above it.
A.
If you know the bottom line of bass clef is,
G.
then you know the space below it.
B.
Who? That's right, F. If you know the bottom line of bass clef is,
G.
then you know the next line up. Okay, so who's this?
G.
Who's this?
A.
Who's this? Whoops. Who's this?
F.
And who's this? Alright, so you know your first group. The next group is based on the top line of bass clef. Who's the top line of bass clef?
A.
Good. If you know the top line is,
A.
then you know the space below that.
B.
If you know the top line of bass clef is,
A.
then you know the space above it. If you know the top line is,
A.
then you know the next line down from there is.
F.
So who's the top line? Then who's this?
Oh, so it's G.
Yes, who's this? And who's this? You got it. You know you're that group. Now remember who the bottom line was? The bottom line of bass clef was G. So if you know the bottom line is G, who's the first little line below that? You skip a note, so what note is this? Right, so the first little line is, say it. Say it loud. Good. And if you know the first little line is E, then you know the second line must be
C.
Okay, if you know the first line is
C.
E and the second line is C, then you know below the first line is
D.
and below the second line is Okay, so who's the first line? And who's this? Who's this? And who's this? Got it. Now, near the top line, do you remember who the top line of bass clef was? Who's the top line? A. Right, so if you know the top line was then you know the first little line is So, first little line is the second little line is E. So if you know the first little line is and the second little line is then you must know that the above the first line is and above the second line is
F.
So, who's this?
C.
And this
E.
and this
D.
and this.
F.
Very good. Okay, and then our last group is based on 3 spaces down. Who's 3 spaces down? Very good. If you know 3 spaces down is, then you know the next space above that is
D.
no, because when you go from space to space, you're supposed to skip a note. So if you know 3 spaces down is, then you know the next space up is, then the line between those 2 spaces is good. So who's this? Who's this? E, and the line between them is all right. Good. So now you know all your bass clef notes. Very good.